Hello, my name is Ebenezer and I'm the one to guide you through this particular lesson. In this lesson, we will learn how to write an IELTS pie chart essay. I will teach you using some step-by-step process to plan and write this IELTS pie chart essay, and I'll help you to achieve the high marks in tax 1 that you need. I'll guide you through a 5-step process, and I believe we'll be able to help you through that. So let's look at the steps. When you are writing this essay, you need to go through these steps. First of all, you need to understand the question that you are reading by analyzing the question. Secondly, you need to identify the main features within the graph, and then you write the actual essay by starting with an introduction. You go through the overview of the text, and then you write your detailed paragraph. Very essential that you learn these two parts before you go through the introduction, main body paragraph, and conclusions. Ideally, before you write the essay, all your essay should have 4 paragraphs. Okay, so paragraph 1 should hold the introduction, 2 should be the overview, 3 should be the main feature, first main feature, and then the 4th part will be the second main feature. We now have everything that we need to begin planning and writing our IELTS pie chart essay. So let's look at our practice question. It states here that a pie chart shows the nutritional consistency of 2 dinners. Okay, so 2 different dinner, and it shows the nutritional consistency of the dinner. And it's here we should summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant, and that we should write at least 150 words. Each question consists of a first sentence, which is this one. Okay, first sentence, which describe briefly how the graph is. Okay, so it shows a brief description of the graphic. It shows what it's talking about, and it gives a very brief description of it. The second sentence here also shows the instruction. All right, so like all of this one, it tells you the instruction. So here it tells us that we should summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant, and that we should write at least 150 words with that. So these are the instructions given to us. And then the third part of the questions always come as a graphic, so the picture of it. So this is how the structure of the essays in Writing Tax 1 looks like, and it's similar to all of them. Now, if we look at the second sentence, which is this one, the question tells us that we must do 3 things. It tells us to select the main features, and also write about the main features, and also compare the main features. Here states we should select the main features, summarize the information, selecting, reporting, making comparison. So summarize it is important, select it is important, report them important, make comparison important. But note that all the tasks that are being stated here are referring to the main features of the graph. Okay, so you don't have to write about every single thing that you see in the graphic. You are not supposed to write extensively about everything in the graph. What you need to note is to find out the major features in it. At least write about 2 or 3 key features that you see in the graph, and then write about them. That's all that you need. So when we come to this graph, or in the IELTS, these are the things that you should note. So in the second step of the planning process, the first step was that we should analyze the question, look at it and examine it, and that's why we examine the questions. But the second side is to identify the main features. Okay, so that is what we are going to do right now. if you look at the graphic in IELTS pie chart questions, what I'll tell you is that it should not be difficult for you to interpret. Okay, each of the questions has been created to test your language skill and not mathematics ability. So don't be looking for at the percentage there and try to be calculating every single thing that you see. Though pie charts always show percentages and proportions, but apart from that, they are essentially the same as bar charts and line graphs, in that they are a way of presenting the data visually. So all that they are doing is that they're just trying to present the data that is there in a form of a graph or a graphic format so that you can see. But it's basically English that you are trying to or an essay that you're trying to write. So don't be thinking a lot about the mathematics when you are doing it. All you are looking for are the main features in the graph. This will usually be the easiest things that you actually spot within the graph. Okay, if you look at this particular graph, you can write tons of information in this graph, but in the IELTS, that is not what we're expecting. We're not expecting you to write every single thing on it. What we need from you is that you look at the graph and understand you need to understand the main features in the graph. That's all that we need. You have to check out to see whether the graph given to you is a dynamic graph or is a static graph. When it comes to using the timeline, you should be able to identify whether the graph is a dynamic graph or a static graph. Okay, and that will help you to know the kind of questions you're supposed to ask and also help you to get the main features that you need. So if you look at our sample question, the sample question here is a static graph because it doesn't show any trend in the space of time. If you look at it, it tells us that the pie graphs show the nutritional consistency of two dinners. You can see there is no timeline to tell us whether it starts from 1995 to 2002 for us to just show see those trends in between the time. So this one, there is no time at all. So basically we are comparing between two different variables and other keys within the graph. That's all that we are doing. So our sample question is a static chart, and because of that, there are some questions that we need to ask ourselves in order to get the main features. So let's look at the questions and answer them and then find out the main features within. So here are some of the useful questions that you can ask yourself to get the main features. The first one is, what are the units of measurements? Okay, and this is obvious. You can see from here it's basically percentages. Okay, so you can see from here that this is percentage that we are dealing with. So we are dealing percentages here. So that is it. That is the unit of measurement. What are the time periods? And as we stated, you can see that there is no time period in this particular question. If you read it, it tells you that the pie chart shows the nutritional consistency of two dinners. And so we should summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features. And if you look here, there is no time. So there is no time period stated in here. And the third question is, what can you learn from the titles, and are there any labels? Okay, so if you can see here, there are some titles here. The first pie chart is about the medium baked potato. The second pie chart is about the macaroni, right? The macaroni. And we have a major heading here, which is the nutritional consistency of two dinner. So the titles are important because they will help you to actually know if it gives you more understanding of the graph itself. Sometimes it opens up what exactly the question is talking about. So it's important that you read and understand them. So the title, and that we have here, the nutritional consistency. So it tells us the nutrient within each dinner, the percentage of nutrient in each dinner. And so the nutrient, we have all these things are very important. Let's look at some of the keys in it. We have when it takes the medium baked potato, we have saturated fats, we have other nutrients, we have carbohydrates, protein here, glucose. So it seems there are four main nutrient types and other nutrients, right? So we have carbohydrate, protein, glucose, and saturated fat. Same here, carbohydrate, protein, glucose, saturated fat, and other nutrients. So these are the 5 major things that are within each of the DNS, and that have been actually brought out that we should check the charts of each of them. So we have had a look at the titles, we have looked at the labels. Now the next question to ask ourselves is that what are some of the notable keys or notable features that we found, because there is no trend in this, so we can say the notable features that we found in here. So for you to get the notable features when it comes to static graph, these are some of the questions you can ask yourself. What is the highest? What is the lowest? What are some of the similarities? And what are some of the exceptions? So these are simply comparing the variables among themselves. You can choose from each one of them and try to do it individually. Thereafter, you compare them. Okay, when you have 2 figures like this, you can choose to do this one separately, and then you can choose to compare them after. So let's look at baked potato itself, only baked potato. What is the highest nutrient? It contains the one with it contains more carbohydrate, right? So that is 35%, and then followed by protein, this 25%, and then we have other nutrients combined. It's also the same as that of glucose. So carbohydrates, protein, glucose, saturated fat is the least in this one. So carbohydrates, protein, glucose, and other nutrients are at par, and then we have saturated fat to be the least. Let's go to macaroni. We have carbohydrate also taking the highest. So same, you have carbohydrate being the highest, and then protein and glucose were quite the same, but this time saturated fat was more in macaroni. So we have the highest amount being in amount of carbohydrate in macaroni, followed by a lot of fat, and then protein and glucose were the same, and then the least was other nutrients. All right, so at least looking at this one, we can have a fair idea that the highest in medium baked potato was carbohydrate, and the same in macaroni. Now we've seen baked potato has more carbohydrate, and the same aside the major nutrients, the other small, just 5%. Also, when it comes to baked potato, it's only saturated. Now let's go to those that are similar. So the similar ones are those that are the same. So other nutrients, glucose, are the same. They have the same percentage, the same proportion of glucose and other nutrients in that of baked potato, and that of macaroni too. Protein and glucose are quite the same in macaroni from here. So these are some of the things that you can just be looking at. Are there any exceptional? The last one is exception. Are there any exceptional thing that we've seen here? I don't think so. No. Now we've been able to capture the major things in here. All right. So now that we've been able to capture these important things, what we need to do is that we will write all these things down, and then we will now bring out at most 3 important major features that we need to use for our essay. Okay, so we've been able to analyze this thing together. We've been able to identify the main features together. It's important that you take note of these questions and try to understand them and use them. If you want to have more detail on how to use these questions and the checklist for identifying the main features on all the different types of IELTS writing question tax 1, then try to look at how to understand and analyze how to analyze tax 1 question. I have made a whole video on that, so you can just look at that one. So Now that we've been able to get all these, pie chart generally have titles and labels, okay, or sometimes keys instead of having those segments, that is the X and Y axis. Okay, so these keys are very important. They help you. I'm talking about these ones. These keys, they will actually help you to know each segment and what they represent. Okay, so from what we've got so far, we've been able to know which one was the highest in all of them. We can see the protein. When it comes to baked potato, the major part of baked potato contains carbohydrate and other protein, right? So baked potato is high in carbohydrate and protein, while macaroni is also high in carbohydrate and saturated fats, right? So we've been able to note that in here, but we can see that carbohydrate is actually more in macaroni than that of baked potato, while protein is more in baked potato, macaroni. So all these comparisons can be made. So we have 35% here, 52%, which is macaroni has a lot of carbohydrate. When it comes to baked potato, it's just 35%. But when it comes to protein in baked potato is more, 25%, but just 11% here. Saturated fat, 21%, 10%, right? Glucose, 15%, 11%. So we can say that 15% here, 25%. So glucose and protein are more in potato. And then we have carbohydrate and saturated fat are more. So, and even when it comes to other nutrients, to baked potato has more of other than the added nutrients than that of macaroni. So we can have all these things down, and then you use it to write our major features. So let's try to write down these main features. What are the main features that stand out? And I believe while we have been working out this way, you have got some of these major features. You would want to pause the video and try to write down your main features. You can write about 2 or 3 main features that you found, depending on how we have been analyzing the question. You'll come back again. So let's look at the main features that I just wrote now. So looking at the graph, there are 2 main features that I found in this graph. First of all, I just saw that macaroni has higher percentage of carbohydrate and fat. So if you look at macaroni, you have carbohydrate, fat, right, as we were just talking about. So carbohydrate very high in macaroni as compared to that of sweet potato. So carbohydrate and that of fats. So 21% here, but 10% here, right? 52% here, 35% here. So there are a lot of carbohydrate and fat in macaroni than that of baked potato. The second main feature here is that there is higher amount of protein and glucose in medium baked potato. All right, so when it comes to medium baked potato, there are a lot of protein and glucose. So let's look at that. Protein 25% here, 11%, glucose 15% here, 11%. So it tells you that these are the comparisons that we have made. Okay, there may be other important features that you might actually rectify. For instance, let's look at this. We can talk about other nutrients. All right, other nutrients, we can talk about them because they're also part of the graph. You can't leave them out. Okay, so you should also talk about it, but we can add everything up in the overview. So we may not be able to have that space to cover all of them in the overview, but we can note it just in case we need to make up words within the body paragraph. Okay, so the key features that we have selected here now, these key features. So these key features that we have selected will be the starting point for our essay. All right, you will then go on to add more details when you are writing. Remember that we are going to use 20 minutes within the writing task 1. and you are supposed to write not less than 150 words. So if you're able to get to 150 words, you are okay. So don't be including too many information. Don't add too many information. Try to include the most important things. That is what is needed. Okay, so now that we have these two main features, we understand what we are going to write. Let's look at the 4-part structure that we are going to use. Very important. Let's look at the structure that we are going to use now. So in the structure of our essay, our first paragraph will be the introduction, second paragraph will be the overview, third we'll write about the first main feature, and the fourth will cover the second main feature. Now that we have everything that we need, we will begin with the essay. And remember, we said we're going to start with the introduction. So let's look at our introduction. So in the introduction, you should simply paraphrase the question that is given to you, and that is all. So if you see, we have this question here. The pie chart, the pie graphs show the nutritional consistency of 2 dinner. All right. So in the introduction, all that you need to do is to simply paraphrase the question. All right. So you are going to write the same thing in different ways. It's like somebody asks you a question about what the graph is about, and you want to tell the person what it is about, but you don't want to use the same words. Okay, so you can do this by using synonyms or changing the sentence structure. All right, so let's try to write the introduction for this particular question. So let's look at the question first. It states here that the pie graphs show the nutritional consistency of 2 dinner. Before you can do this, you have to first understand the question. That's why it's very important that you understand the question. Read every part of it and understand it so that you can write a very good introduction. So looking at this question, we write our introduction. Right. So this will be our introduction. The graphs, because there are 2 graphs here. Just take note of that. Yes. 2 graphs. So the graphs compare the proportion of various nutritional compounds, okay, or nutritional various nutrients. Okay, you can just say the graph compare the proportion of various nutrients. That's all. So the graph compare the proportion of various nutritional compounds contained in 2 different foods, macaroni and medium baked potato. So you can see that the introduction covers the entire thing, what it is about. So it's about writing it in your own words, and that is all. So that's all for the introduction. You can pause the video and try to write your own introduction. Now let's move on to the overview. So the overview will hold the second paragraph. So in the second paragraph, you are going to report the main features that you see in the pie charts. You give only the general information, okay? So the details will come later in the essay, right? All that you need to do is that you have to make clear comparisons if you spot some of them, and also you have to just take note of the major things within the graph. So that is what you are going to do in the overview. So looking at this graph, we're able to come up with 2 important main features when we're planning. Okay, so we saw that first of all, the macaroni, which is macaroni, has higher percentage of carbohydrate and fat, and then the second main feature was that there is a higher amount of protein and glucose in medium baked potato. So that's all that we saw in that, and these were the 2 major features that we picked. Now what we need to do to get the overview is that we will form these 2 ideas, and if you're able to get 3 ideas, you form the 3 ideas into statements. Okay, so you write them in statements. So you state the information simply using the synonyms where possible. Okay, so don't use too difficult words to understand, too complicated words to understand. Don't use too elaborated vocabularies. Just go simple. All right, don't be too complicated. Just write words that are appropriate in the text and use correct verb tense. Okay, so let's look at an example for our overview. Now, this is our overview. In general, so if you are starting an overview, just start something to show that you are linking these words. Okay, so in general, there are larger percentage of carbohydrates and saturated fat in macaroni, right? So if you take macaroni, carbohydrates, saturated fats, higher amount. Okay, so there are higher percentage of carbohydrates and saturated fat in macaroni than in medium big potato. In contrast, so now we are going to the opposite one, which is now talking about medium big potato. So in contrast, medium big potato has a much higher amount of protein and glucose. So you can see that it is the same thing that I just wrote here that I used in the overview. You don't need to elaborate anything. All I need to do is to form sentences with the points that you got. Okay, you can choose to change them if you have other synonyms that make sure that you keep the same statement. So now we have the overview written, and you can now move on to our fifth step, which will be to write our first detail paragraph. So now we've got to the main detail paragraph. So that will form the paragraph 3 and 4. So in the paragraph 3 and 4 of your essay, that is where you're going to include more detailed information about the data within the graph. Okay, so if you take the data within the graph, that is where you're going to include all the major detailed information that you have about the graph. So we are dealing with the paragraph 3 now. So you should give the evidence to support your first key feature. So if you remember, we had two key features. We talked about the macaroni first, and we dealt with the big potato. So we're going to deal with our first main feature, and we will make comparisons where relevant. Remember, we stated that we have to summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where necessary. So you make comparisons where relevant. So let's look at our first main feature. Our first main feature states that macaroni has higher percentage of carbohydrate and fat, and that is the first main feature, and that's what we are going to write. So this will be an example of what we could write. In particular, macaroni mainly consists of large amount of carbohydrate and saturated fat. So you can see here the same statement. I use that one to start my work. When it comes to the detailed paragraph, what you are doing here is that you're going to prove to the people that, or the writer, that this is what I'm talking about. So if you remember in the overview, you gave a general view about the graph. You stated that macaroni contains a lot of carbohydrate and saturated fat. You also stated that big potato contains a lot of protein and glucose. So in the detailed paragraph, you're now going to tell the examiner that this is what I meant by including all the important features that are within. Okay, so that is what we are doing here right now. So in particular, macaroni mainly consists of large amount of carbohydrate and saturated fat. Carbohydrate takes up slightly more than a half, okay, while a little less than a quarter is made up of saturated fat. Now let's consider it. When it comes to pie graph and percentages, you need to learn how to change these percentages into words. Okay, so you have to note that. So when it comes to 50% is half, right? So carbohydrate percentage in macaroni is 52, which is more than a half, slightly, a little more. So that's why I use this statement, a little more or slightly more, all right, in here. So you need to learn these words that are used in percentages. So 20% is a fifth, right? 40%, 40% is I think 25% is a quarter, right? So you need to learn all these things when it comes to pie charts, right? So you need to learn all these things, are very important. So carbohydrate, it takes up slightly more than a half, which is 52%, while a little less than a quarter. So let's take a quarter is 25. So if it's a little less, then it's within 20 and 25. Okay, so you can see 21 here, just a little less than a quarter. Oh, okay, so someone can say slightly more than a fifth, but that is too much calculation. So you can say a little less than a quarter, which is 21%, is made up of saturated fat. So we've proven to the examiner that yes, it has more saturated fat and carbohydrate than that of baked potato. If you take baked potato, it's 35% and 25%. Exactly, sorry, 35% and 10%. So 10% saturated fat and 35% carbohydrate. So these are some of the things that you should be noting. Other nutrients shows relatively lower proportion. So other nutrient just 5%. So you can see here, as I was telling you in the planning process, I told you that there are some of the key features that you might not be able to add it in the overview, but you can choose to put it in, because you have to highlight every part of the graph. You need to highlight every part of the graph. You don't have to showcase only one part. You have to highlight every part, but you don't have to talk about every bit of detail within the graph. There are differences. There are two different things that I said here. You have to highlight every bit of it. We have something about saturated fat, other nutrient, glucose, protein, carbohydrate. You have to talk about them, but you don't have to talk about every single detail within it. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to say. So now we've talked about other nutrients, but we just stated that it shows relatively lower proportion. So at least we've said something about it, which is true, just 5%. So that is what we should know. So this will be our paragraph 3. You can also try to write some detailed paragraph depending on what key features you had and what you wanted. So you can pause the video and try to write a detailed paragraph 1. Now let's move on to the detailed paragraph 2. There is no conclusion in tax 1, so you don't add conclusion. So we have the first, minute, and second detailed paragraph, and that will be all. So you do the same thing for the second one as you did for the first one. So we take the second key feature and then we will write about it. Okay, so in the second feature we stated that there are higher amount of protein and glucose in the medium baked potato. So if you remember the first one, we took macaroni and we talked about macaroni, and then the second one we are now taking baked potato. We are going to talk about baked potato. If you are given just one pie graph or pie chart, then you can just talk about all of them together, but here we are given 2, so we have organized our essay by taking each paragraph to cover one of them. But you can make comparison among them. Remember, we stated that these ones, this higher amount of protein is in comparison with that one of we are comparing the baked potato to macaroni, so it's not just one side, we are just comparing both of them. So you should take note of that. But this time we are focusing on baked potato as a major one. All right, so let's look at it. We now have the feature, so let's look at an example of what we could write about this. All right, on the other hand, so we used a connective device linking wires to just show that we are now going to deal with another side of it, which is very important. It links one idea to the other, and we are now linking paragraph to paragraph. You will need this in coherence and cohesion, so try as much as possible to be using them. On the other hand, medium baked potato. Okay, so now we are dealing with medium baked potato, so you should take note of that. On the other hand, Medium baked potato is mostly comprised of carbohydrate and protein. Is that true? Let's go on. Carbohydrates and protein. So we can see that more carbohydrate, more protein, right? The amount of carbohydrate in the food is less than in macaroni. So carbohydrate at 5%. If you look at macaroni, carbohydrate is 52%. So the amount of carbohydrate in the food, which is that of medium baked potato, is less than that of macaroni. So we are using comparison here. We are comparing here, which is very important. But they still take up the greatest percentage of 35% in the medium baked potato, which is true. Okay, so we are just making those comparisons, which is very, very important for you to do. Okay. Interestingly, this dinner cereal, which is the baked potato, has a large amount of protein, which is 25%, which is very different from macaroni. So if you look at macaroni, 25% of baked potato, but macaroni just take 11%. So which is a very wide difference between them. The other types of nutrients do not show significant figures in the pie chart. So if you look at it, we have just 15% for other nutrients and 10% for fats. Okay, so at least we've talked about most of them, which is the saturated fats. We've compared glucose, we've compared carbohydrate, we've done protein. So at least we've talked about each and every part of them, which is really, really important that you do. And now we've compared both baked potato and that of macaroni. There are some things you should note in pie chart. One, it deals with percentages and proportions. So you have to understand how to write, how to convert these percentages into words, right? To change these wordings. It's not only all the time that you might be writing 10%, 5%, and the rest. At least sometimes you might be changing them from 25% to be a quarter. Okay, so if you have not been using them, but don't use them also too much. Just blend them together. Okay, so that is what you have to be doing. And also another thing that I will tell you is the use of tenses. I just want to say a quick word about the verb tense in this one. So if you take this sample question, it doesn't give you any kind of time. Okay, since there is no time frame that is given in the question, you could use either a present simple tense or past simple tense. Okay, so it's very, very important that you take note of that too. Whichever tense that you choose to write or you choose to use in your essay, you should remember to be consistent throughout the whole of the essay. Okay, so it's very important. All right, so now we've written down the 4 paragraphs. Let's try to put all of them together and get our full essay done. So here are the 4 paragraphs that we have just brought them together to create this finished work. So let's look at how it's done. The pie graphs compare the proportion of various nutritional compounds contained in 2 different foods, macaroni and baked potato. In general, there are a larger percentage of carbohydrates and saturated fat in macaroni than in baked potato. In contrast, medium baked potato has a much higher amount of protein and glucose. In particular, macaroni mainly consists of large amount of carbohydrate and saturated fat. Carbohydrates takes up slightly more than a half, 52%, while a little less than a quarter is made up of saturated fat. The other nutrients shows relatively low proportion. On the other hand, baked potato is mostly comprised of carbohydrates and protein. The amount of carbohydrate in the food is less than in macaroni, but they still take up the greatest percentage of 35% in medium baked potato. Interestingly, this dinner cereal has a large amount of protein with 25%, which is very different from macaroni. The other nutrients or other types of nutrients do not show significant figures in the pie chart. And this is 166 words written. So the sample chart is over the minimum number of word limits that we need to write, and you can see that we did not include a lot of elaborated things. Okay, so it is important that you select just a couple of the main features that is important and write about them. So now that you have learned about this, I believe that you can practice it. Start slowly at first and then keep practicing until you can plan and write a complete essay in around 20 minutes. Thank you so much, and I'll meet you in our next lesson. Bye.